We begin the works for today, and without any more introductions, without any more thanks, etc. And now it's the time for Andrés Páez from the Universitat de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. It's your time.
I want to start by thanking Jordi for the invitation to speak today, and I would also like to thank Carmen for all the good work she's done organizing the conference. This is the first time I give a lecture in a law school because my specialty is not legal epistemology or the philosophy of law. I work mostly in philosophy of science. So when I was invited to give a talk here, I was looking for a topic which might be suitable both for people in the legal field and also that would contribute something to what I do. In other words, I wanted to kill two birds with one stone, and I thought that the topic of testimony would be the perfect choice because I guess testimony plays a central role in any legal procedure, and it's also a topic which has been neglected to a large extent in epistemology itself. There are only very few papers and books regarding testimony, so I thought that I could maybe say something interesting about the topic. Now, when I say testimony, I mean testimony in the widest possible sense. In other words, I don't mean testimony in court, I don't mean testimony in a legal context, I mean any oral or written report which might include even reports about one's own life. For example, the date of my birth is something about which I have no direct evidence because even though I was there, I can't remember which day it was or anything of the sort, so I have to rely on my mother's memory or I have to rely on the reports of the hospital and so on. So it includes reports about oneself, it includes reports about things which are inaccessible to me in spatial and temporal, in a spatial and a temporal sense. And most importantly, it also includes reports about experiments and observations. In other words, whatever I read in a scientific journal falls under the name testimony in the sense that I want to talk about this. Sometimes even testimony includes reports from experiments that I would never be able to do myself. In other words, testimony includes things that I have to accept only on the basis of trust and on the basis of whether it was performed by a reputed scientist and so on. So I will talk about that in a bit. But I want to make it clear that it's testimony in the widest possible sense. Now, there are two very interesting characteristics about testimony which I should mention from the beginning. The first one is that testimony is probably one of the most important sources for belief, even beyond inference or beyond sensory experience, because sometimes when you are perceiving something directly, the brain processes the information and immediately discards it, you forget about it, but many of the things which are retained in the brain are obtained through an effort by reading testimony or by paying attention to what somebody's saying. So that's the first feature. The other interesting feature about testimony is that we accept it most of the time without reflecting on it. We read the newspaper, we listen to the radio, we go to classes or conferences and so on, and or we talk to people on the street, and probably 99% of the things that we hear, we just simply accept at face value without thinking much about whether it's true or not. And life would be impossible if we didn't do that. Life would be impossible if we didn't simply trust that what people are saying is mostly true. But sometimes in business, in law, in science, in many fields, in daily life, doubt arises. You have to, you try to find out whether, you really want to make sure that what somebody's saying or reporting is true, because it might have very serious consequences if it's false. So there are only very few occasions in which testimony becomes the subject of inquiry. And that's what I'm going to be talking mostly about today. That's what I call the reflective acceptance of testimony. Now, one question is, why do we tend to accept testimony at face value most of the time? Well, Thomas Reid in the 18th century already remarked that perhaps human beings have a natural tendency to accept the words of others at face value without much reflection. I don't know if that's true, but that's at least there's a precedent in modern philosophy regarding that question. More recently, Taggart has analyzed the issue, and it seems that if a report is consistent with a person's beliefs and there is some degree of trust in this person, that is sufficient for a person to accept the testimony without much reflection. And Fricker has argued that perhaps there is a subconscious mechanism by which we assess the plausibility of what people say, and we're not really aware that we're doing that, but it seems that there might be some kind of psychological mechanism by means of which we usually process that information. So this is just I just wanted to bring this today to point out that it's an active research question. Why do we usually accept testimony? But that's not the subject of my talk today. Now, what I want to talk about is about those cases in which we are thinking about what we are doing when we accept testimony, when we are actively deciding whether some person's testimony should be accepted or not. And there are different ways in which this could be done. For example, one could try to find a justification for the testimony that one is accepting. And perhaps the most famous attempt to find a justification for testimony appears in chapter 10 of Hume's inquiry regarding concerning human understanding. In the chapter on miracles, Hume says the following: "Our assurance in any argument of this kind," meaning any testimonial argument, "is derived from no other principle than our observation of the veracity of human testimony and of the usual conformity of facts to the reports of witnesses. It being a general maxim that no objects have any discoverable connection together, and that all the inferences which we can draw from one to another are founded merely on our experience of their constant and regular conjunction, it is evident that we ought not to make an exception to this maxim in favor of human testimony, whose connection with any event seems in itself as little necessary as any other." Hume's idea seems to be that we constantly observe a conjunction between what people report and the facts that are being reported. If you read the whole text, it seems that Hume is thinking of types of testimony. In other words, scientific reports or newspaper reports or different types of reports, which consistently coincide with the kind of facts that are being reported. So because we observe the constant conjunction between reports and facts, it seems that we can trust testimony. That seems to be Hume's reductive account of why testimony should be accepted. In other words, we reduce testimony to the direct report of the senses, because you observe the testimony, you observe the facts, and you see the coincidence, and then you have a basis to trust what people say. Now, that reductive account has been criticized mostly by Cody in the 1970s, He was the first one to point out the main problems of this reductive account, and he's mostly responsible for reviving the subject of testimony in contemporary philosophy. Maybe you can't see the red writing, but it says the first problem is circularity. The main problem is that most testimonies obtain their support. If you want to justify testimony and see how testimony reflects a fact, you have to rely on other testimonies. It seems that it's very unlikely that you will be able to find a constant conjunction between reports and facts unless in one way or another you rely on other kinds of testimony. And the second problem is that even if you are able to see a constant conjunction between reports and facts, that conjunction will not be strong enough to allow you to reach an inductive inference regarding the truth of testimony or the tendency to the truth that testimonies have. In other words, the basis, the kind of cases that you can directly observe in which you see the report, you see the fact, are very small. It's a very small basis for an inductive induction. I'm sorry, for an induction. So if that's true, it seems that there aren't many prospects for a reductive account of testimony. It seems that it's very difficult to justify testimony in terms of something more basic than testimony itself. Now, what is the option? The option is not to try to reduce testimony to something more basic, like direct observation, but rather to rationalize why we accept testimonies on the basis of something else. Chapin, who's a historian and sociologist of science, suggests that perhaps the way in which we can accept testimony is on the basis of trust, and more specifically on the trustworthiness of the person who is providing the report. So he analyzes, for example, the discussion surrounding the discovery of the air pump in the 17th century, the discussion between Hobbes and Boyle and other examples, in which eventually the reason why the existence of a vacuum, for example, is accepted is because of the trustworthiness of the person providing the report that the vacuum is possible and that a vacuum exists. So the idea is to reduce the reasons why we accept testimony to a moral basis, to the trustworthiness of a person. The problem with this account is that it's very difficult to explain how a testimony can be mistaken when it's not a lack of trustworthiness which creates a false testimony, but rather sheer incompetence. If a person doesn't have the tools or the knowledge or is not in a position to report truthfully about something, then this account would not be able to explain that that is the case. Hartwig addresses the question of scientific authority. His argument is that in contemporary science, there is no one scientist who can perform all the experiments required to verify the basis of his or her current research. So if you want to say anything interesting in science, you have to trust what other people have done before you. And you have to trust what journals report, you have to trust what your colleagues are doing, and without that trust, scientific progress would be impossible. So he tries to analyze how that mechanism works, how people assess if another person is an expert or not. So in the end, it's also an argument which is directed towards establishing a basis for trust in the scientific enterprise. So this is a different way of approaching the problem. What I'm going to do today is to find a different way in which you can analyze why a certain testimony can be trusted, not because the person reporting is an expert or because you consider that the witness is trustworthy, but rather because there are other ways in which you can assess the information which is being provided by the witness and you can reduce it in a different way than what these people have done. I'm going to use a distinction which was introduced by Peter Lipton in a 1998 paper, in which he argues that if you want to understand how testimony can be justified or how it can be analyzed in a reductive way, there are two different approaches. One would be a premise reductive approach, which would be to try to do what Hume was doing. In other words, trying to find more basic premises based on direct observation, which would provide a basis for testimony. Lipton argues that Hume's approach and that any other approach which tries to reduce testimony to something more basic is bound to fail, and I agree. I think that it's pretty much impossible to find a basis for testimony which only relies on direct observation or something more basic. The other approach which he endorses, and which is the approach that I'm also going to adopt, is what he calls a rule reductive approach. The idea is that if you can show that there are some mechanisms or rules that determine how beliefs are accepted in general, and you can also show that testimony falls within those rules, or that when you accept testimony, you're following the same rules that you follow when you accept other kinds of beliefs, then you will have a basis for the acceptance of testimony, for the reflective acceptance of testimony. That's the basic idea. The question is, what kind of rules, what kind of mechanisms are going to be involved in the acceptance of either testimonial beliefs or other kinds of beliefs? Lipton's suggestion is that, this is basically what I just said. His suggestion is that the mechanism that should be adopted is inference to the best explanation. His idea is, I just quote Lipton, in the case of testimony, the most straightforward application of inference to the best explanation would be to say that the agent infers that what the informant said is true, just in case the truth of what was said is part of the best explanation of, among other things, the fact that the informant said it. In other words, the idea is that we want to find an explanation for the information that the witness provided, but that explanation, and this is clear from the context of Lipton's article, is essentially a psychological explanation. We want to know what elements were involved in the decision process that led the witness to say what he or she said. So let's analyze the situation. The idea is an individual A says that P. That's what we want to explain. That's the explanandum of an inference of the best explanation. And the why question, which is going to guide the research, is why did A say that P? But that why, in Lipton's sense, is to be understood in a purely psychological sense. If you want to understand why A said that P, there are many things that could be involved in that possible psychological explanation of the fact. Alvin Goldman identifies many different elements which will be involved in a psychological explanation of why a person says that P. For example, the witness or the person giving the report has to decide which of the facts witnessed will be reported. If I see 10 facts or 20 facts, I might only be able to report 2 or 3, so I have to decide which of them are interesting, which of them are worth reporting. The witness also has to decide whether to exaggerate the facts or report them faithfully, or perhaps try to diminish their importance. There might be some conscious attempt to distort the facts. The witness also has to decide how to communicate, which means to use. If the witness wants to reach thousands of people, there will be one means to do that, while if the report is just from one person to another, there will be other means to do that. And finally, the witness has to decide who should be the target of the report. All of these decisions are involved whenever a person says something. Whenever you open your mouth to say something, whenever you write an email or write on a blog, or when you write a newspaper article or a book, all of these decisions are involved in your mind when you're trying to report this. The problem is that if we're looking for the best explanation of why a person said something, most of these facts are entirely private. Most of these facts are completely inaccessible to third parties. So it would be impossible for a third party to really assess whether a report is or is not trustworthy if you only look at the facts which are involved in the psychological explanation of why A said that P. The other problem is that that psychological explanation is going to leave out lots of different facts which are quite important, in my view, for assessing the truthfulness of a report. For example, the receiver wants to know if the witness was in a position to observe the fact, if she has the necessary knowledge or training to make the claims she makes, or if she has a good track record in making true claims, and so on. And none of these facts are included in a psychological explanation according to what Lipton is suggesting. So what I'm going to do is to try to find a different rule-based approach to how we can accept testimony, how we can finally end up deciding to believe that what somebody is saying is true. My approach is based on a theory set forth by Isaac Levi in the 1980s and 90s, which is essentially a theory based on pragmatist-based ideas, essentially on Peirce's belief-doubt model, which I'm just going to quote Peirce for a second here. Peirce says that doubt is what really pushes forward any inquiry. Without doubt, a person would not be motivated to start investigating or researching any given question. He says that doubt is an uneasy and dissatisfied state from which we struggle to free ourselves and pass into the state of belief, while the latter is a calm and satisfactory state which we do not wish to avoid or to change to a belief in anything else. I shall term this struggle to free ourselves from doubt inquiry. So the starting point for any inquiry will always be a state of doubt. And that's exactly what happens when you start accepting testimonies, when you stop accepting testimonies at face value and you decide to start an inquiry regarding a given testimony. So I think this is something which is characteristic of how we treat testimony. We accept it normally, it doesn't create doubt, it doesn't generate any state of uneasiness or dissatisfaction until something very important is at stake, and then we doubt. Now, Levi's approach is guided by two specific desiderata. The first one is that if you're trying to start an inquiry, one of the main objectives of any inquiry is to obtain new information, but new information which is error-free. And based on the discussions that I heard here yesterday, I think that the avoidance of error is something which is central in legal epistemology as well. So I'm glad to hear that. And the other would be the acquisition of valuable information. In other words, you want to obtain information which is error-free, but at the same time, you want to obtain information which is of importance to you because of your specific epistemic and cognitive goals. It's impossible to talk about the value of information unless you make that value relative to some specific goal that you want to achieve through your research. So given the interest of a cognitive agent, the agent is going to determine what is valuable and which information is worth pursuing and which information is not worth pursuing. Now, a third element which is essential to understanding what's going on here is that what Levi wants to analyze is how, given a set of beliefs that an agent has, what beliefs I have at this precise moment, for example, how I, with those beliefs, would assess the risk of incurring error by accepting new information, and also how I would assess the value of the new information that I want to accept. Those two things have to be relative to my stated belief. That's the basis of Peirce's belief doubt model, and also the basis of the approach that I want to pursue here. The problem is that those two goals, the avoidance of error and the acquisition of valuable information, pull in different directions. Because if you want to avoid error, the best strategy would just be to not believe anything new. You just believe what you believe, you're sure of what you believe, and then if you don't believe anything else, you are safe. On the other hand, if the tendency to accept valuable information is going to be tempting, and you might end up accepting beliefs which are full of mistakes. So you have to balance the two things. What we want to achieve is the best trade-off between the acquisition of valuable information and the avoidance of error. Now moving on to the specific problem of testimony. The idea is that the starting point has to be that some testimony has generated doubts in the mind of the inquirer. Some testimony has generated doubts in the mind of the agent, and the agent has to undertake the enterprise of finding out whether that testimony should be accepted or not, or whether I should remain in a state of neither accepting nor rejecting that testimony for the time being. Those are the three options. So my strategy, or the proposal that I want to bring today, is that when you are evaluating a testimony, you're really undertaking you really have to go into two different steps. The first step is to try to find a justification for that testimony, in a sense that I will explain in a second. Once you have obtained justification for that testimony, then you have to evaluate whether the justification that you found is sufficient, given a certain standard of proof or given a certain standard of acceptance, whether that justification is sufficient for the acceptance of the testimony. So you have to first find the facts which will justify the testimony, and afterwards decide whether that justification is sufficient. Now, how does one find the justification for a testimony? My idea is that one has to imagine which facts would make a given testimony more probable than not, which facts raise the probability that a testimony is true. So I brought a few examples to illustrate what I mean. Suppose that a witness is reporting that the getaway car in a bank robbery was blue. The following is a partial list of facts that increase the probability that the witness is telling the truth. The witness was in the close vicinity of the bank. The lighting conditions were such that the color of the car could be easily determined. The witness is a respected school teacher. The witness is not colorblind. All of these facts increase the probability that the report is true. Now, it's important to bear in mind that these facts most of these facts increase the probability that the report will be true, but they don't increase the probability of the fact reported. In other words, the fact that the witness is a school teacher has no incidence on the fact reported, only on the probability that the report itself will be true. Or take a different case. A series of experimental results are published in a highly reputed journal by Dr. G. The following facts increase the probability that the report is true. Dr. G holds a doctoral degree in the field. Dr. G is a tenured professor in a research university. The journal uses a double-blind peer review process, and previous experimental results reported by Dr. G have been confirmed by or replicated by other independent researchers. Again, those four facts increase the probability that the report that you read in a journal is true. On the other hand, there are some cases in which that scenario is very difficult to replicate. For example, if some stranger approaches you on the street and tells you that Michael Phelps, the 14-time Olympic gold swimming medalist, drowned this afternoon, well, you're not going to believe that. It's very unlikely that that happened. You might probably think that the person is lying or making up a story. And then you find out that Michael Phelps was in fact scheduled to use the local pool this afternoon, but there is no other information available. Now that increases the probability that the report is true in a very small percentage, but that percentage is probably not going to be sufficient to persuade you that the report is true. So you might find an insufficient justification for a given claim. And then you have an extreme case, which is what happens on the internet. For example, in an internet bulletin board about publicly traded company X, people will start exchanging gossip about whether the stock is going up or it's going down, or whether a new discovery is being made, or whether the price of oil is going up or down. And you have no idea who these people are. You have no idea what's going on. You have no idea if they're trying to push the price up or down. So since there is no possible fact that you can discover which might raise the probability of the truth of the report, then in those cases, I guess the only reasonable position is to be completely skeptical about whether the report is true or not. Maybe using an inductive strategy, seeing which of the participants in the chat room usually get it right and which usually get it wrong, you might be able to figure something out. But that would be a different strategy that I'm not contemplating here, because there is no further information that you can gather about these people. Now, the question is, how does one define that information? How does one, what's the correct way of presenting that justification process? That's the question I want to address. My idea is that if K represents the state of belief of a given person, could be me at this point right now, and the letter phi is a sentence that states that the testimony that I'm giving is true, then the probability of phi is the epistemic probability in K that the witness is telling the truth. How does one justify phi? That's the question. How does one find a justification for the sentence that says that a given testimony is true? So the idea is I'm going to define a set of sentences, big psi, as a potential justification of phi relative to K, just in case the following is true. The justification has to be consistent with my set of beliefs. That is true both when you accept something automatically or when you accept it as a result of a reflective process. You're not going to accept a justification for a testimony if it contradicts your beliefs. That seems to be pretty clear. The justification has to be something new information that you obtain. Why? Well, sometimes you already know facts about the context, you already know facts about the situation, but it's only when you realize that there's a fact which is increasing the probability that the report is true when you change the epistemic status of that report in your state of belief. Simply having some facts about the situation doesn't help until you relate them, probabilistically speaking, to the fact that's being reported. Now there's a sentence, small psi, which is going to be a report of the fact which increases the probability. For example, the fact that the witness is a school teacher. And there's going to be a probabilistic sentence which says that the probability of the report given that fact is higher than the probability of the report itself. The fifth clause says that there is no spurious correlation between the two facts. In other words, that that the information is really relevant, that it's not something which is collateral or spuriously correlated to the report. The sixth clause says that they're logically independent. You don't want the justifying fact implying the report, because that would be cheating in a way. I mean, the probability of the report would be 1 if psi is true. And nothing else is an element of phi. So to sum this up, the idea is that every potential justification of a testimony is a conjunction of a sentence which states a fact. For example, the witness is a school teacher, and a probabilistic sentence that says that a report given by a respected school teacher raises the probability of the truth of that report. That combination of those two sentences are a potential justification of the testimony. Now, I'm going to define a set O small phi, which is all of these kinds of justifications that a given person is able to imagine or find out about a specific case. In other words, if you think of all the possible facts that might raise the probability that a report is true, there might be thousands of facts. But an individual can only imagine a very limited number of facts. I don't know, 10, 20 facts, which you might sum up as things which are relevant and important for the truth of the testimony. So that's what is included in this set O phi. What does one do with that set? You have this set of possible justifications. So my idea is you have to, first of all, assess how credible those possible justifications are. How credible is it that this person is really colorblind or not colorblind? How credible is it that this person was present at the site, at the place of the crime? All of these things have to be assessed in terms of credibility. So, for example, if you have a medical report that the person is not colorblind, probably the creedal probability of that fact is going to be quite high. If you just have hearsay or something like this, well, probably it's not that high. And you also have to assess how useful those justifications will be for the given testimony. This is a little technical, I'm going to skip the details. But the idea is that once you have all these justifications, you have to find out which are the most valuable because they explain a lot, because they're really relevant, because they change, they're a game changer in this specific case, and which are just marginally relevant to the case under consideration. So once you have assessed how valuable they are in terms of the information they provide, the idea is that you're going to combine both measures, the credibility of the potential justifications and the informational value that they provide. And the way in which you combine them is by finding the best trade-off between them. So you don't want, if the information is very credible, you will have a tendency, let me explain the formula. The epistemic value of a potential justification equals the sum of alpha by the credibility of that potential justification plus 1 minus alpha times the informational value of that justification. So if the information is very credible, you might want to accept it. You might want to assess how risky it is to accept that information based on the fact that it's very credible. If it's not very credible, but it's very valuable, you might also want to accept it. So you want to find the best trade-off between these two different tendencies. And the result is that you should reject the potential justification if its epistemic value is negative, if the trade-off is negative. You should remain uncommitted to the potential justification if it's 0, and you should accept it if its epistemic value is positive. When you gather together all of these potential justifications which have a positive value, you have obtained the justification you were looking for this specific testimony. But now, that's just the first step. And that's what I think is really important to understand. There are two options. If you weren't able to find any justification for the testimony, then you should not commit yourself to that testimony. That seems to be pretty obvious. You heard something, you have doubts about that something, and you couldn't find anything which might make it more probable. So the reasonable thing to do is to stay in the same state in which you were before. Just continue doubting until further information is available. But if justification is found, you have a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the acceptance of the testimony. And this, I'm going to explain why. The idea is that once you have accepted all of these testimonies into your belief set, you're in a different epistemic state that you were before. You know more now than you knew before. And now you can reassess how credible the testimony is under this new light. And you can also reassess how valuable it is under this new information. So the idea is to repeat the process of evaluating its credibility and its informational value under the new circumstances. Now, if you look at the credibility of the testimony, the idea is that the new information that you obtained through the justification process should make the testimony more likely than not. That seems to me like an obvious consequence of trying to find a justification for something. If the new information doesn't make the testimony more likely than not, then you wasted your time or you never obtained the kind of justification that you wanted. So the idea is that under this new circumstance, the creedal probability of the testimony should be higher than the creedal probability of its negation. In K star, which represents the new state of belief in which the justification is included. Now, if the creedal probabilities of both of the testimony and its negation are equal, then you should suspend judgment regarding that testimony. How could that happen? Suppose that the testimony was unlikely under your old state of belief. Once you have the new information, the testimony and its negation become equally likely. Well, in that case, you don't have enough warrant for that testimony, and you should not accept it. If the creedal probability of the testimony is lower than the creedal probability of its negation in K star, then you should reject it. For example, in the Michael Phelps example, the information you have might raise the creedal probability of phi slightly, but it's still not enough to raise it above the creedal probability of the negation of phi. So you will remain in exactly the same epistemic situation in which you were before. And finally, if the creedal probability of phi is higher than the creedal probability of its negation, then the next step will be you have a necessary condition for accepting a testimony, but the next step will be to evaluate its informational value. The idea is that once you undertake the same process and you find the same trade-off in the same equation, then you will be able to say that a testimony is acceptable or not. So it's a two-step process in which you do the same things. Evaluate its credibility, its informational value, but in the background information will be different. In one case, it's the initial state of doubt. In the second case, it's a state of belief in which the justification has been added to your initial state. So this is the way in which I think that the evaluation process should proceed. And as I say at the end of the paper, the question is if this is too mushy. In other words, if it's too subjective and too individualistic. Why? Because the assessment of the risk of error and the informational value are only connected to what an individual thinks. In other words, all of this account only starts with one individual who decides how risky it is to accept something and how valuable it is to accept some information. And the other problem, which might make it a little subjective, is that the whole process of justifying testimony only starts when one individual has doubts about that testimony. It's my doubts which trigger the inquiry. It's not like a neutral field where you start an investigation, but rather an individual's doubts. But I think both problems can be solved. Regarding the first problem, I think it's fairly easy, and I have done it in other publications. It's fairly easy to extend this individual account to a community of inquirers, at least in the sciences. Perhaps in other fields this is not possible. But at least, for example, in physics, which is the example that we were discussing yesterday, there is such a consensus about the basic facts, the basic theories, the basic ideas of a specific field within physics or chemistry or biology, perhaps, that it's possible to find a common measure for the value of certain information. You just take the individual measures and find a weighted average. And it's also possible to find a communal creedal probability also by finding a weighted average of the individual creedal probabilities of the scientist. So in some context, at least, and in some scientific context, I think that it's possible to find that communal measurement for creedal and informational value. And regarding the second question about the doubts, the thing is that what one person considers doubtful, another person might consider entirely established. So the fact that scientific inquiry proceeds in this haphazard manner in which one person decides that something is interesting to investigate because there's something fishy about it, and another person thinks that that's been established, should not be an obstacle to the advancement of science. Because in the end, the idea is that if one person finds some fact or some testimony fishy or doubtful and has sufficient reasons to show the others that it's doubtful, then doubt will spread, or the other way around. If you think that some testimony or some report is fishy and you find enough justification, then the word spreads around and that testimony will be justified for future inquiries. So I want to close by quoting again Peirce. It's too bad that Susan isn't here to correct me. Regarding the way in which all of these independent inquiries in science might converge into one established opinion. Peirce says, different minds may set out with the most antagonistic views, but the progress of investigation carries them by a force outside of themselves to one and the same conclusion. The opinion which is fated to be ultimately agreed to by all who investigate is what we mean by the truth, and the object represented in this opinion is the real. Thank you.
Okay, the debate is over. Right.
I'll start. So, yes, thank you for a very interesting discussion. There are two different levels. One's a practical level, one's a theoretical level. The practical level, what you're doing is talking about evidence law. All those things that you're referring to, such as wanting to know whether the person was there, is she colorblind, did she have good perceptual ability, it's much more complex than you put up there. Does her memory operate properly? Does her recall function operate properly? All those things are exactly what the law of evidence, at least the American law of evidence, among other things, deals with. And the way in which we solve these problems, not that it's a substantive solution, is to let the parties decide how much of this they want to inquire into. At a theoretical level, though, I think I don't understand your theoretical structure, because it seems to me that your strongest assumption is that the things you process have to be consistent with your prior beliefs. That was your number one proposition. That if that's the case, doubt can never spread. If I believe in creationism and I believe it fully, I cannot become an evolutionist on this model.
No, there are several pages in the paper in which I discuss exactly that case, because you might find some fact or some proposition which is inconsistent with your beliefs, but you want to give it a fair hearing. So the idea is to try to contract your state of belief to a state in which you might consider the truth of that fact.
But then consistency is doing no work. It's doing zero work. Because if there's an inconsistency, well, then you retreat. If there's still an inconsistency, you continue to retreat, and you continue to retreat. It's doing zero work. I think the problem is, the central problem is the problem of inconsistency, of incompatible beliefs that we all walk around with. And how it is we make sense of that problem, not trying to find eventually a foundation of consistent beliefs, no matter how constricted, and giving up everything along the way until we get to that position. It just seems to me to be misdirected.
Okay, there are two levels again, a practical level and a theoretical level. I think at a practical level, it is true that any real human being is full of inconsistent beliefs. That's undeniable. But the idea of this theory and of most of the theories that are set forth in the belief revision literature have a rationality constraint, which is that this agent, which might be fictional, or which is fictional, is an agent that has only consistent beliefs. That the set K is a set of consistent beliefs.
No,
I understand.
By saying whenever I'm faced with an inconsistency, I can peel off my beliefs until I try to find again a consistent state of mind. Consistency is doing no work. It's doing zero work.
No,
because no matter where you are, you can continue along this process.
It's doing some work once you reach that state, because once you reach that state in which you have peeled off the inconsistency, then you can evaluate what kind of things would make that testimony more credible or give it more warrant. The thing is that it's not easy to find a mechanism or an algorithm. I mean, it's impossible to find an algorithm which might lead you to that new consistent state, because there are many ways of peeling off those inconsistent beliefs. That's true. That's a theoretical problem. But once you reach that state, there are different possibilities how to do that, and different states that you might reach which are consistent. Then the consistency starts doing the work, because the evaluation of the justifications has to be consistent with that new state of belief, with the peeled off inconsistencies.
Again, it starts doing the work until you come across another inconsistency.
Oh, sure, you take it one by one, of course.
Exactly, and then the process begins again.
Sure.
Okay, so it seems to me it's doing zero work. What you're doing is you're trying to reach, I think Lipton is right, you're trying to get your best understanding of the world. That understanding is going to include tensions and inconsistencies in your beliefs. That's a problem, but it's a problem no matter what they are, no matter what your beliefs are. And it's not a solution to that to say, let's pretend we can eliminate those inconsistencies. The solution is to deal with the inconsistencies and to recognize that those are part of your belief states. And now the question is, which is the best explanation of those that are available to you, given what you know?
But you're saying that the way to deal with it is to try to understand why we are inconsistent?
No, to embrace the reality of the fact that you will, in fact, have these inconsistent beliefs. You'll be pulled in different directions. You're not going to have a tightly knit deductive structure of knowledge. It's going to answer any interesting questions. Even mathematics, this doesn't work there either. You know, the struggle with infinity and so on. And so what you have to do is make judgments about at a utilitarian or practical level, which is the best approach given what I know, which includes that I don't have a fully consistent set of beliefs.
Well, there are mechanisms to isolate the inconsistencies within a belief set. For example, you can introduce partitions within a belief set in which you can find consistent subsets of your belief set. And based on that consistent subset, you can start the evaluation process. So that's a way of making it more realistic, of trying to include the fact that human beings are inconsistent into the modeling process based on deductive logic. But I understand your point. I understand that there's a big gap between the ideal agents which are proposed in artificial intelligence and in deductive systems and real human beings. But the idea is that maybe through that modeling in artificial intelligence and in formal epistemology, we might learn something interesting about how real human beings work in very restricted situations in which we want to apply very strict rationality constraints on the process. I mean, this is not suitable for daily life. This is not suitable for a bar discussion or something like this. But in scientific discussions, when you have very defined, well-defined context where the facts are established, where you don't want to use any kind of fuzzy logic or something like this, why can't we learn something about those reasoning processes if you look at what happens in the ideal cases? I think that needs an argument.
Michele.
Well, I appreciated very much the report, mainly in the last part of it. I mean, in what I consider as the logical treatment of justification and so on. I find it interesting and also useful. But as a lawyer, I have to make some steps lower in the level of abstraction. And from this point of view, I just make a couple of remarks. One is this. In the context of law, and specifically in the context of the administration of justice, which is not a very narrow context, it's an extremely broad one, in the last more or less 2,000 years, we were always faced with the problem of how to assess the credibility of a witness. So we don't lack experience on that. The history of both systems, so to say, common law and civil law, is full of rules, attempts, mistakes, evolution, and all that, always focused to the aim of ensuring at least a minimum of rational credibility of what a witness says. So I'm not inclined to set all this aside and to start again from zero, considering problems like this. And in this historical perspective, it sounds a little strange to me to start from Hume and not to start from the doctrine about evidence and proof in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance period, and so on. There are libraries full of that. So I'm a little bit surprised, let me say, looking at people who start from nothing simply because they don't consider that in another area really exactly the same problem has been dealt with a huge variety of solutions. But, well, this is the point of view of the lawyer. Every day I'm faced with these problems, in courts and out of courts, as an arbitrator, not as a judge, as well as an advocate. So, it's true that the division of labor between the departments of philosophy and the departments of law is a problem. I would add that also the division of labor between the departments of philosophy and the departments of psychology is a problem. Because, well, there is a huge psychological literature about the psychology of testimony, about how the witness reconstructs, manipulates, remembers, and so on. And in my opinion, these factors must have some value at the moment in which the trier of fact which is not a person like many jurors or a judge, has to assess the credibility of what the witness says. And I am also inclined to consider that, setting aside the history, there are, in the law of today, machineries, sometimes very sophisticated machineries, as the Anglo-American cross-examination, for instance, that were construed exactly with the aim of checking the reliability of the witness. So we don't consider that? Well, I quote Wigmore when he says that the cross-examination is the greatest legal engine ever invented for the search of truth. Wigmore may be mistaken, but anyway, it is worth discussing if the technique of contradiction is or is not a technique aimed at controlling. There is also the fact that usually the witness swears to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I may say, well, swearing anything that doesn't count, but counts. Because if I am considering a sworn declaration is one thing, if I am considering a chat on the web, I am dealing with a completely different thing. And the problems of credibility and of justification are completely different. One more remark. In the practical world of lawyers, we usually are not dealing with one testimony. And the ancient wisdom creates the rule that one testimony was not enough. They required at least two witnesses in order to confirm a statement of fact. And the real problem with which we are constantly faced is the plurality of testimonies, converging, diverging, consistent, non-consistent. And we are accustomed to say that the best way to control the reliability of one testimony is to take into account all the other testimonies, and then see how they combine, how they conflict one with the other, and so and so and so. So in the real world of the administration of justice, assessing the credibility of a witness is an extremely more complicated task than assessing whether or not John Doe was justified in saying that the dog are flying. Therefore, insofar, and I shut up, insofar as there is a formal analysis of the justification, okay, it's maybe a useful way for being conceptually fine in doing this kind of work. But I wouldn't agree with such a strong simplification of the problem.
Okay, clearly I'm completely ignorant about all this tradition within the legal system about how to assess witnesses and so on, and I'm willing to learn. My concern is a little different. My concern is that perhaps, I mean, again, I don't know anything about the subject, but perhaps there's a difference between philosophical treatment of testimony and assessing techniques and having heuristics for dealing with witnesses within a specific context. For example, I think that if there are wider questions which have to be dealt with if you want to talk about testimony. For example, why do people tend to believe testimony most of the time? Those are things that are...
But is it true?
I think it's true.
I don't think so.
Well, but that's a trivial problem.
That's not a trivial problem at all.
It's a trivial problem. Michele, what he means by testimony, Michele, he's not talking about testimony in court.
Yeah.
He's talking about testimony in the Cody sense of the term, in which almost all of your knowledge comes from the reports of others. So, for example, when you go to school, you read books. We would call what you read in a book hearsay, right? It's hearsay. It's somebody else's statement. But he means testimony in that sense. Now, nobody but a madman would doubt the reliability of testimony if they live in a reasonable state of human comfort today. You are here today because of the reliability of testimony.
Sure.
That's why it's trivial. You have nothing but almost one-sided experience.
But it's not trivial.
With the value of the testimony that has led you to be the chair of the department at Bogota. Now, there have been along the way a few problems, that have gotten in the way where you relied on something that turned out to be false. So there is a negative set of false testimony that you embraced to your regret. The guy is just overwhelmed. I mean, exponentially overwhelmed by the reliability of the testimony that has informed your background, knowledge, beliefs, and so on. So it's trivial. The fact that you can make a mistake, sure you can make a mistake. But in terms of why you rely on testimonies, because you have almost uniform experience with the beneficial effects of doing so.
It's not trivial why at some specific point I start having doubts about a testimony. That's not trivial.
That's not what you asked. You asked, why do you rely on testimony?
Sure.
That's a different question.
It's not a different question. It's related, because what makes me doubt about testimony in a given case is exactly the same thing which is missing when I start doubting about it. So the two questions are related, and I can't see how they're a different question.
I agree that they're related.
Sure. So if you want to know why, when you hear something or you read something, suddenly doubt arises, that question also answers why it doesn't arise in most other cases. So it's not trivial, because you have to find out the positive answer to the question of doubt.
Just very quick, you replicate it. Just on the trivial point, you've replicated at the meta level the problem with language. When philosophers say something's trivially true, they make something like it's truistic, or nobody who seriously thought about this could doubt the fact. But in idiomatic English, when you say something's trivial, it means that's so obvious as not to be worth mentioning, and these are not the same things. So Ron, having picked up the point about language, then in a way inadvertently recreated the problem by using a phrase which means one thing in technical discourse and another thing in idiomatic English. So we can agree, can we not, that things can be trivially true, which this is, and still worth pointing out to people who are ignorant of trivial truths. So that just a clarification. We can all agree, yes, on this? Yes?
Okay. Marina.
Just a small remark regarding what Ron Allen had said, and after also Michele Taruffo, about trust testimonies in trials, which is very different from trusting testimonies in ordinary life. You have asked why we trust testimony usually. I think we trust testimonies, but my answer would be we trust testimonies because otherwise we can live our ordinary life. We need trust testimonies because of pragmatical reasons. My remark, Ron Allen, in his intervention the first time, put the accent on the problem that how to manage the inconsistencies in which testimonies. I will add that it's not only a problem of how to manage inconsistencies, but also on how to manage consistency, because not most of times, but many times, we have testimony perfectly consistent with all the sentences we have, and we can doubt. In my opinion, I have always been very skeptical about judges, which are the most. Judges who trust testimonies more than other kind of proofs. I don't understand why, because trust testimonies, especially in a courtroom, is the most complicated task a judge faces, yeah? And I think I appreciate very, very much all your attempt to justify or to construct a model to justify testimony, because I think it's a very good tool for reconstructing our justification of testimony. But I think all these attempts for justify the assertion based on testimony must be ruled or must be guided by a very, very important epistemic principle that is the principle of doubt. You have to doubt always. You have to be open to distrust, to distrust the testimony, because it's very, very epistemically, it's very weak. It's the most or the weakest proof we have. So I think all these attempts that ultimately has been made about psychology of testimony maybe are very useful. I don't know, but it should be used in a framework of doubt. Is hygienically good.
I think that when you think about testimony within a legal context, there are very specific limitations and circumstances and characteristics which make it slightly different from the way in which one treats testimony in normal life. So I completely understand that in a trial, one should keep a certain degree of skepticism about any testimony up to the last minute, I suppose, because, as you say, it is the weakest proof. But in daily life, it's not the weakest proof. In daily life, it's most of the proof. Most of the things that we believe because we have read them somewhere. Somebody has told us it's trivial, as you say, that most of our beliefs are generated through testimony. So it's impossible to find that same degree of doubt if you just look at what happens in daily life reasoning, I think. Mm-hmm. Now, I wasn't finished replying to Michele. Now, you say that when you assess the credibility of a witness in court, you have to assess how that testimony fits with other testimonies and so on. But the account that I give here doesn't exclude that, because the idea is you're listening to someone who's talking, you have some information about that person, but you also have information about what other witnesses have said. That's part of your background knowledge. So when you're assessing the credibility of a given witness, you are already taking into account what the other people have said. Or once you assess that testimony, you include it in your background knowledge when you go to the next witness, and so on. So I don't think that the attempt is just one by one. You can include in that background not only what other people have said, but also when you judge how valuable information is, the information that somebody is providing is, you also have to take into account how much it explains within the circumstances. So that's why when I was saying that informational value is one of the main goals of any inquiry, by informational value I also mean the explanatory value that any testimony might have. And that explanatory value is, of course, completely determined by a specific context, by a specific question, by a specific circumstances in which other people have already said other things. So I don't think that just focusing on one specific moment when you're listening to one person means that you are isolating that testimony from what other people have said.
Excuse me, I was referring to a different moment in the context of a trial. I mean, to the moment of the final decision. You are through now saying, well, if when I'm hearing the witness number 10, I already heard the witness number 1 to number 9, and of course, my state of at that moment is conditioned. But in the end, I have to take the 10 witnesses and assess them in a possibly coherent and consistent context. Therefore, this is a different. One thing is hearing one by one, and of course, you are conditioned in a way from what already you heard. But at the final moment, when you have to decide whether or not a statement of fact is adequately justified by the testimonies, you, so to say, put everything in the bowl at the same moment, and you have to say, to see how the different witnesses converge or do not converge about specific statements of fact. This is, in my opinion at least, a different situation confronting with what happens in a trial with the witnesses coming one by one.
So what you're saying is that you have to suspend judgment until the last person has spoken.
That should be a healthy role, because if not, you fall into what the psychologists call the confirmation bias.
Well, that's what I was
one
going.
of the fallacies.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, if you want to find the theory of testimony which is closer to the way that the human mind really works, then you should think that what's really going on in a person's mind is that people assess testimonies one by one, and in the end, they might be biased by the first assessments. That's true. But the reality is that they do. When a person finishes a testimony, or when you hear something or read something, you immediately reach a conclusion about it, independently of whether you shouldn't.
Which has to be retrieved in the last moment. That's why I was trying to stress. Moment by moment, witness by witness, you are right. But this is not the end of the problem. This is a part of the problem. The end of the problem is that the good trier of fact would go back and reconsider her own impressions, her own steps in a complete, so to say, perspective. Because the final assessment of proofs is not made piece by piece, moment by moment. May be difficult. Many people actually are not able to do that. But if we are thinking of an ideal model of decision making, my opinion is that the trier of fact should work that way in order to reach a credible, rationally justified outcome. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that this would be a model of rational decision making, reconsidering at the last moment all the evidence you have, not only the witnesses, but also circumstantial evidence and inferences and other.
Okay, Larry.
Is this working? Yes. Andrés, as a fellow philosopher of science, I'd like, I think, to warn you about certain issues I've stumbled over myself, because I think I see them being committed on your side too. That is to say, one of assuming that knowledge, in a way, and inquiry are all of a piece. This was certainly part of Peirce's core conviction, and that one can, therefore, pretty straightforwardly assimilate one form of investigation to another. And I think where the law and the sciences are concerned, that's a dangerous valley, canyon to fall into. And let me focus on two particular respects in which it seems to have occurred in your paper as I read it. I like, by the way, the paper as an account of how scientific knowledge and evolves and how the role that testimony can play in it. Two key elements of the Peircean picture are convergence over time, which you in fact gave passages from, and the question of determining the character of error, detecting error and correcting it. Okay. Now, in the legal context, the approximation over the long run doesn't cut any ice at all, for the obvious reason that systems of judicial inquiry are very, very short-lived, and that therefore the kind of convergent requirements that are necessary to see something like Persian inquiry approximating on the true answer in general aren't exemplified by context of legal inquiry. I think the more important issue, however, here is that certainly those of us like myself and you, I believe, when doing philosophy of science, tend to focus on scientific theorizing. The costs of mistakes in scientific theorizing and theory evaluation are so low as to be virtually discountable, okay? If you accept a new theory of the nature of space and time, you made a mistake, but that's all you did. Okay, whereas if you convict somebody who's innocent or acquit somebody who's guilty, okay, there are very substantial real costs associated with the error in question. That kind of thing, it seems to me, leads to a very different epistemic and cognitive mindset as between the sciences and the law. In the sciences, precisely because making a mistake carries few costs associated with it, okay, there is powerful reason to accept other people's reports of results, particularly if you find them theoretically congenial, right, without being too skeptical. And there's no price associated with being skeptical where there's no particular reason to be skeptical, right? These are the games that bright theoretical scientists play all the time. In the legal context, on the other hand, and I'm at this point, I think, just underscoring what Michele and Ron were saying in a more down-to-earth way, the price of errors at trial is sufficient that the presumption that exists perhaps in common life, and certainly in science, that, well, we can generally accept the testimonial reports of other folks. That's not the prevailing presumption that a trial lawyer or a judge, if it's a bench trial, brings to the situation that confronts him. And therefore, taking the idea that, well, most of the time we trust testimony, right? And that we couldn't get on in life without it. I don't think that's an assumption, even though it's perhaps true in the sciences, perhaps true in common sense. I don't think that's a presumption that should be brought into the courtroom. The last observation that I would make, and this I did find surprising in the paper of a philosopher of science, is that I was expecting part of what your argument would be, was that, look, there's been a hell of a lot of interesting and intriguing empirical research done on the reliability of testimony and its unreliability under circumstances X, Y, and Z. And, you know, instead of giving us the kind of bromides that we find on page 11, where you say, well, you know, if somebody's a school teacher, that does something to enhance the reliability of their testimony. I was expecting to have seen, and would like to have seen, references to this enormous body of literature, some of which is quite sophisticated in terms of experimental design, others not, with respect to the circumstances under which, at least in a legal context, testimony can be trusted and when it can't. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, regarding the last bit about convergence in PERS, of course, it cannot refer to the legal system. That would be absurd. I think that what PERS had in mind and what I was pointing at was how testimony or different starting points in the natural sciences are not that relevant when assessing how the sciences will evolve in the long term.
Right.
So I completely agree with you. It would never be able to. I would never make that assertion regarding anything concerning the legal system. Right, that's true. Now, in terms of the cost of error, I understand that in the medical sciences and in the law, right, also in the medical sciences, the
Agreed.
Cost of error is exponentially higher than in any other field.
Yeah.
Maybe perhaps in public policy it would be comparable, but the stakes are immensely higher in both fields. Now, I don't know if that is that would be a reason to provide a different treatment of the risk of error in those fields compared to what happens in daily life or in the sciences. I think that when Peirce and Levi and many people who write about this talk about the risk of error, they mean something very simple. They just mean introducing inconsistency.
Getting it wrong. Yes.
Getting it wrong, exactly. They don't. There's no financial or moral or any other kind of any other dimension within the notion of error that they're talking about. So one has to put that notion of error within the context of their specific theory. But I agree with you that perhaps one should think it over, think whether the notion of error should be enriched with the specific circumstances which surround it in these particular fields. I think that's an important thing to think about. Now, regarding the last point about psychological research done about testimony in the legal context, I think that that's not excluded. I mean,
no, it's not excluded. Neither is it included.
It's not included. That's true. I mean, when you're doing research about whether some testimony is reliable or not, and you want to find facts which increase its probability, well, those are facts which would be relevant, of course. I think that should be included in the paper. That's true. Thank you.
Giorgio Maniaci. Can you use the microphone?
I have only a doubt. It's possible that it is due to misunderstanding. And my doubt is this. If there is a place, which is the place in your framework for the bounded or limited rationality, in the sense of Herbert Simon and the works of March Simon, etc. Because you say that you quote Levi, the pronunciation is Levi, and you say that is a decision problem. Mm-hmm. This is really interesting because we cannot decide to believe, but it's true. It's a decision problem because it's a practical problem because there are many things that we should decide to do. How to collect information, how to appreciate information, then so on. Then, when you say that there are two desiderata in the framework of Levi, my question is, if you follow Simon and the bounded, the limited rationality, it's possible that there is a third desiderata. Not only value the new information and the avoidance of error, but taking a decision within a reasonable time. Because the problem of bounded or limited rationality is the problem of limited temporal, intellectual, and material resources. Then, for example, when you talk about to measure the informational content of our justification, you say, we introduce a measure that sees no negative values to elements, and so on. And you say the same thing about the measurement of the
The credibility?
The credibility, yes. And to measure the informational value of the testimony. Then my question is, when we are talking about of measurement to assign values, you are talking about numbers, utility numbers. Because what Simon says is that people normally don't decide in this way. It's not rational, it's not valuable, it's not, in many contexts, practical context. I think it's a legal context, is in the process is this context. And it's very, we need, I don't know, how many resources, intellectual, temporal resources to assign utility numbers to some set of elements. Then Simon says is that people normally use different ways of deciding. Then your framework seems to me that the classic rational choice theory. Then there is a place for limited or bounded rationalities.
Okay, sure.
Andrés, there are 2 more questions, and we have at most 5 minutes. Maybe you can reply all of them together. 3 questions.
Well, I have a quick response. Yeah.
Okay.
You're right. This is a classical framework for rational choice, and within that framework, there is no space for bounded rationality. But many people in the last few years have been working on ways of using that same framework and introducing those boundaries. Introducing, for example, what I was talking about earlier, limits between consistent and inconsistent parts of a belief set. Actually, I published a paper on that specific topic, trying to find out ways in which you can introduce more boundaries into the classical framework. But such as it is presented here, there is no space for those boundaries. Regarding the third desiderata of time, I think that time is of the essence in medicine and in the law and in business and in many other fields. And I think that the fact, I wouldn't be sure, I wouldn't know how to introduce it within this framework, how to connect it as a boundary within the original framework. I think that's an open question for me.
Okay, Maribel, so quickly, please.
Quickly. No, to make this easy. Just to say one thing then. I offer you the opportunity to try to test yourself using this as a scenario, as a stage where your own theory has to be checked. Why? Because I think that the opportunity to listen all of you today and yesterday is amazing. That brings us, for example, arguments about Roman law, for example, testimony ways of acting in private criminal law when they use a specific trusting or not situations. You can listen that new evidence to change your mind or not, put it inside your theory. You can listen to that there are something called new chronology that is treated for the Russian scientific society as pseudoscience, but is working fully with mathematical tools. So, for example, when you at the end of your paper said the basic facts completely firm in science, there are so many big stuff in science that is challenged every day. And the poor man that has been working 35 years, working 7 volumes of 500 pages each, is not listening, just that. Then, if you use, for example, in artificial intelligence, AI, and you want to model that, probably is a good way of doing it, but just if you want to do it. And then if you use psychological studies, for example, Ariely about perception, you can put it in and to see what happened. Or if you want to talk about about measurement in philosophy, you have the problem that Maniaci said to you right now. For example, if you want to know what happened with empirical data now in neuroscience and what people believe, for example, students of neuroscience, just listening in a sentence, according to brain scanners, believe 10 times more a wrong argument than if the sentence says some research. So I just tell you, please, this is a great opportunity, the opportunity to see what happened when you have a belief and a set of beliefs, and there are many, many, many different ways of approaching the truth or the truthfulness or the trusting of testimony. And maybe you see why I would not use your theory.
I fully embrace your suggestion.
In 30 seconds. No, Giovanni Tuset. 1 minute.
Coming back to the law against everyday context, in fact, my impression is that there are two very different maxims at work. In everyday context, the maxim, to my impression, is accept a testimony unless you have good epistemic reasons not to do that. In the law, it's the other way around. Don't accept a testimony unless you have good epistemic reasons. So it's very different from that point of view. And a second remark, at least in the law, in the context of the law, what is interesting is to see what the interaction is between the persons who are involved in some issues where you need a testimony. For instance, you put questions, the witness gives you answers, and you put other questions. Maybe this is maybe missing from your account, but it's an important aspect of testimony, at least in the legal field.
Sure. Well, I agree with you that there will be some aspects which are not included, because the idea was to give a very general account of testimony in every single context. But of course, in specific contexts, you have to find some restrictions. But the thing is that you say that in everyday life, the rule is to accept something unless there's a reason not to. But it's not clear what the reason not to is. I mean, why people start doubting. That's what I think is an interesting question to ask. And simply finding inconsistencies with one's beliefs would not be enough. I mean, sometimes I read things in the newspaper and I say, what? And then I just turn the page and I don't do anything. So the interesting question is why at some point I decide to pursue an inquiry into whether some testimony in everyday life is true or not. That has to be analyzed in terms of epistemic goals and epistemic the epistemic aspects of the situation, and that's mostly what I was trying to do through that mechanism.
You're the boss. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.